This week on The Sceptic, I speak to Andrew Orlowski, business columnist at The Telegraph, about the curious case of the Mansards, the people who think that by picking enough litter, they can get the economy growing again.
Westminster is a laboratory at the moment for what is a kind of a new donor class in policy making, which is flexing its muscles. And they are utilitarian and in some cases a very kind of dangerous radical strain of utilitarianism.
Jack Michael Rankin has been duly elected.
And I speak to Jack Rankin, the Conservative MP for Windsor, on whether the Tories have really learnt the lessons of their torrid 14 years in government, and whether, even if they have, anyone's listening.
I think fundamentally, if you've been in office for a great period of time as a centre-right government and the state is spending 47% of GDP, economically, how do you square that to your core voters?
Plus, why he's referred Hope Not Hate to the Charity Commission.
A lot of these so-called anti-fascist charities are nothing of the sort. I think they're simply aggressive, progressive authoritarians who believe in their moral righteousness that almost anybody else can be dismissed out of hand as some kind of radical extremist.
And for our premium subscribers, I speak to Ben Pile about the woeful anti-capitalist rent-seeking of the Green Blob.
This is the worst of capitalism and the worst of socialism, because for the duration of the climate policy agenda, there's been a kind of attempt to sort of make everything look like a market mechanism, not subject to centralised control, but then sort of using quasi-market policies to deliver the same kind of thing.
Plus, with the lockdowns are making a comeback.
After the inquiries, there's a lot of life has been breathed back into this horrible corpse of the COVID-ism. A lot of revision of the figures to sort of try and give some plausibility to some of the stories that weren't plausible in the first place.
Hello and welcome to episode 61 of The Sceptic, the Daily Sceptic's weekly podcast. I'm your host, Laurie Wastell, an associate editor at the Daily Sceptic. Now, can you build a brand new town through AI graphics and PowerPoint presentations? Has the child-killing menace of the bully XL been eliminated from our streets because of the posting to policy pipeline? Can we solve the free speech crisis with a website and some social media clips? And can we get the economy growing again by going litter picking and cleaning graffiti? Well, you might think that all sounds rather far-fetched, but there are people who believe these things. They're often known as the Mansards. And to discuss all that today, I'm very pleased to welcome to The Sceptic Andrew Orlowski, who is business and technology columnist at The Telegraph. Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks for having me again, Laurie.
Yeah, very good to have you here. So this is quite a broad topic, Andrew, in a way. It's kind of an intellectual and sociological trend that's also transatlantic in its provenance in some ways. And you've been documenting it for a while. I suppose just give us a general idea of who these types of people are and sort of, how you've put your finger on this tendency.
Yes, I think Westminster is a laboratory at the moment for what is a kind of a new donor class in policy making, which is flexing its muscles. And so over the last year, we've had lots of pop-up campaigns claiming to be movements, think tanks, they've engaged marketing agencies, even pollsters. And what they all have in common is they're kind of fundamentally utilitarian and solutionist. And I'm being really careful not to say they're effective altruists, because a lot of them have this common lineage, if you like, back to this very cultish intellectual gathering, which was kind of used to debate philosophically 10 years ago online, still recruits very aggressively on campuses. But I think the key thing is that it's new money. There's lots of new money. I think this is more than everyone else in policy making put together. And they are utilitarian and in some cases a very kind of dangerous radical strain of utilitarianism.
And I suppose before we get into specific examples of this, well, people will have seen some of these types if they're on Twitter, but who are they in everyday life? Yeah. Where do they congregate? Where might people have seen them?
Well, probably the best known example is the Abundance Agenda, which is an effective altruist funded campaign in the States, started by centre-left journalists, received hundreds of millions of dollars from kind of EA-aligned groups. Here we'll have things like Looking for Growth, that's an experiment. The Centre for British Progress is a new pop-up think tank, came out of EA circles in, I think, Oxford. Many others. So YIMBY, for example, is a phenomenon I mean, it's had so little impact compared to the amount of money it's had. These are all kind of supply-side interventions into a policy debate by people with really no experience of it, which at best are kind of naive and at worst are kind of very clumsy and damaging for not just the right, but for how policy is formulated in general. One example is lobbying on nuclear, very, very recent. There are attempts to remove lower the safety thresholds for things like radiation and the backup systems that go on nuclear reactors. Nobody involved has any technical background. And it only takes one leak for the nuclear industry to be set back another 30 years because the Green Blob is waiting for that radiation leak. So these range from ridiculous attempts, like there's one attempt to clean graffiti off a tube train by LFG. They never went back. To these kind of deep policy attempts. They're all experiments, really. I mean, yeah, they're all experiments, effectively.
And so tell us a little bit more about why you see this as a problem or annoying, at least. I mean, they're talking about abundance and things like this. And I mean, you would presumably accept that we're over-regulated and perhaps even that we might need a few more houses to be built. So, well, why is this a perverse approach? Yeah,
I think we are over-regulated, but there's another writer who deals with it, which is Dan Davis at the FT, who wrote a terrific book on why they're called an accountability machine, on why kind of organisation and institutions are unaccountable. Terrific book. He calls it. I mean, he also recognises it's policy analysis which is completely decontextualised. So the solution is very quick. It's very gimmicky. It's always on the supply side, and it doesn't recognize the kind of world that inhabits. He calls it infrastructure brain, but it actually applies to a lot more things than infrastructure. My favorite example, so thanks to very delinquent border controls, we've allowed enormous amounts of very low quality migration, which then moves into the kind of black or semi-black economy, Deliveroo. Now, Deliveroo isn't one of the things that keeps the world going. As Maurice Glassman said, you can always learn to cook at home. You can go out for a meal. There's no kind of information problem of where there is a Chinese restaurant near me. Does it deliver? You ring them up, you go on the website, you get your meal delivered. But it's created this kind of massive distorted economy, which to many of these effective altruists is a great thing. They love open borders. So it was suggested that instead of having all these drivers clogging at the pavement, why don't we just scrap the parts of the Highway Act that relate to safety on pavements and deliver the hot meals through urban areas through a self-driving vehicle? Now, let's have a think about that for a second. I call it the self-driving suitcase scenario. So you've got a box full of hot food, pizza. It's going on the pavement because it can't go on the road. It has to go around 20 miles an hour. And it's going on the pavement, bumping old ladies out of the way, roadmen, children, mothers with prams. That is the classic kind of, here's a technological solution. Here's this regulation which must be inhibiting it. Let's just get rid of the regulation and then happy times will ensue. It's a very shallow policy analysis. It's quite absurd as well.
And so solutionist is a word you use there, and that very much makes sense to me because it does seem to me that these movements don't really understand the need for hard graft in politics and political campaigning, but rather think that you can just do a few flashy graphics and that's all it takes. And this is very much an evidence to me in this new campaign which calls itself Speak, which popped up recently, which describes itself as a non-crank and non-partisan free speech campaign. And so apparently they're going to single-handedly change the fact that lots of people in Britain are arrested for speech offences. And well, I suppose, what did you make of that, Andrew? But, we already have a fantastic free speech campaign in Britain called and that's the Free Free Speech Union, and they are not just making graphics and sort of encouraging people in a vague sense online to pay attention to certain of our speech laws. They are fighting like hell to defend people. They defended hundreds and hundreds of people over several years now, and they're a mass membership organisation. This is political activism. But this requires hard graft, not just sort of solutions.
Hard graft, really unfashionable cases, most of which don't make the newspapers at all. And it's made a real impact on people's lives. I might have differences where the FSU takes a position on this or that, but I think it's absolutely the most important organisation in Britain, and it's had a huge impact. There's a big clue I noticed in the guy who started this has no background in law. He's kind of been aligned to the effective altruist movement, and no background in law or civic activism. But he's written a paper for the effective altruists about the effectiveness of civic activism. He was replying to a thread by another effective altruist. Now, this person is replying to a question, said, I feel like I shouldn't apply for grants and funding from the EA movement, who are showering money at everyone because my parents are well off. And the answer comes, winning grants is good for your resume, connections and mentors, which will set you up for better positions. So that really explains where Speak is coming from. It may well, I'll be surprised if anyone can remember it's in a year's time. It's effectively it's a grift. It's all about the person's career. And this is the problem with utilitarians. The ends always justify the means. And you see this repeated throughout. You saw it with Sam Bankman-Fried even. I am doing good, therefore I can do evil along the way because I'm doing good in the long run. It's quite a moral inversion. These people are quite dangerous. And I think a great example was during lockdowns, where the goal of suppressing coronavirus meant that almost everything else took second place to it. So a lot of these people became lockdown fanatics, and the behaviour included doxing people, really, really appalling behaviour from some of these protagonists who now say they're for progress and for growth. Well, if you want growth, you don't lock everyone up for 2 years. That would seem to be the case where I think a lot of the online right looked at them and said, right, we kind of figured out who you are now. But the media hasn't picked up on any of this yet. We're for an abundant future, or we're for growth. They just take these things at face value. They should be a lot more critical.
And many of these issues aren't simply ones you can provide a solution for. There are trade-offs, right? And of course, the key political controversy that our political class has been failing to deal with over the past, decades really, is immigration. And this does impact on several of these issues, the Deliveroo stuff, of course, and likewise the YIMBYism. Yes, we can say you need to build more houses, but at the same time, the main reason that we do have such a housing shortage is that there's so many people coming in. And this, again, is a more politically controversial end of the issue, which these types just want to ignore. And so there's a sort of way of approaching housing in this totally politically inane and toothless way, which just says, we just need to build more. Well, that's not the whole issue, is it?
Yeah, I think what happened with NIMBY and YIMBY, and I'm quite glad I think I had, without boasting, I think I had some impact on that, was that it was unchallenged that this was only a supply-side problem. Because I say the protagonists are all very for open borders. I mean, I might have said this the last time I was on the Sceptic podcast, it was a gaslighting exercise to try and get people to go, well, we must build the houses reluctantly, sigh. Well, no, you don't actually. There are other policies here. And I think the online right doesn't realise what a threat this is, because it diminishes the democratic scope for debate, but it kind of, the utilitarianism that the effective altruist progress people espouse kind of excludes and pushes out all other kinds of politics, like can we get a grip on the borders? Who should we have coming here? And so on. And funnily enough, I think the left, parts of the left, particularly the sort of the harder left, were far better at identifying the moral problems of effective altruism and of utilitarianism. And now, I can probably digress a little bit away from housing. It's got this really peculiar strain, which not all of them share, but a lot of them do. So it's not just that the ends justify the means, but they have this really peculiar calculus where the lives of future unborn human beings must be taken into account. What that does, either explicitly or not, is to downgrade the welfare of all the human beings who are alive now. You can see this in extreme cases. There's a very kind of attention. He's been around for 20 years, called Yudkowsky, who's kind of said, look, we must stop. It's okay if almost all of humanity perishes as long as the super intelligence is allowed to continue. He's kind of single-handedly promotes this AI doomer cause. But you see that a lot. I mean, again, going back to lockdown, you saw the suffering of children and the loneliness and the kind of psychological damage that was created by lockdowns doesn't register at all with a utilitarian or an effective altruist. They're all about, the number at the end of the day. So I think these people are really dangerous. They're indifferent to human suffering, a lot of them, and they're completely indifferent to communities. You can say they're spreadsheet people, but it's actually kind of worse than that. I mean, they'll boast that they cross left and right boundaries because they've been very influential in both Conservative and Labour parties, which are these kinds of shells. They found it quite easy to take them over.
So in terms of the sociology of this demographic, Andrew, because it does seem to be quite an interesting character type, it seems partly to be a aging millennial obsession. Do you have a sense in particular of why that might be?
I haven't thought of the millennial. I mean, some of them are reaching middle age now, which has only been possible through, for some of them, you look at certain protagonists, say Anglo-futurism or LFG, that if you look at the resume, huge chunks have been sustained by this cult, which is a very kind of wealthy cult. They'll have been given kind of grace and favour jobs. I don't think it's that millennial, because what you've got now, you've got a real crisis in graduates who are absolutely outstanding graduates, can't get jobs, even coming out of Oxford, Cambridge or Durham. But the EAs promise undergraduates we'll have something for you. And with all these new pop-ups like LFG and all these other related experiments, there is actually a job waiting for them when they come out. So it's attracting people of all ages. I think it's more of a personality type. To me, it's a bit like a dream in which you're trapped in a Montessori school with very kind of hyperactive children who want their attention and kind of endlessly need approval. But when you kind of listen to what they're saying, they are just children. So it's like a boy runs past. It's like, look at my rocket. Okay, Tom, you love your rocket. Who's in your rocket, Tom? It's a squirrel. Where's the squirrel going, Tom? It's going to Mars. And it's got a Union Jack on it. I mean, it's like the level of discourse here is so poor, so low. And yet when I go on Twitter, the online right is very active. You agree with it or not, it's kind of fecund. It's there's a lot of kind of debate. What should we do? I think this is a kind of the effective altruism is a kind of two-footed studs up tackle on democracy. Speak is an explicit attack on the free speech union, and I think I think we'll see more articles on this. But I just hope journalists should rediscover their curiosity about and not be afraid of calling it a cult.
And I suppose to return to that question of this potentially crowding out more controversial political issues or them not being willing to take them up. I mean, there's that implicit self-comparison with the Free Speech Union where they describe themselves as non-crank and non-partisan and say, well, that's very nice, isn't it? You can pursue free speech as an issue, but without ever having to get your hands dirty with anything like that. And well, that's nice to have, I suppose. Likewise, as you mentioned, the online right has been very fecund. It gets a lot of stick at times, but actually it has very much moved the discourse on things like indefinite leave to remain and other issues as well. And meanwhile, on that issue in particular, the LFG types came very, very late to it. They weren't really the ones to move the needle on it at all. And so it does suggest that there's actually an unwillingness to approach these very important issues, but which are actually not sufficiently, in their eyes, politically safe.
Yeah, I mean, some of this, you're absolutely right. It's a threat to, but not the right, but not just the right. I mean, you're right. It's not just there's pips. There's a lot of kind of decent muckraking, I call it, and I intend that only as a compliment going on Twitter of people going, hey, what's this and what's this? And can we have this transcript and so on? It's really good work. You have to judge people by what they do, and this is excellent work. I do think the British response to the end of globalization kind of plays a role in it, in that if you look at America has formulated, whether you like it or not, a kind of an interesting challenge, which is we're going to reindustrialize, we're going to really control these borders, we're going to not get involved in wars of ideology, particularly. And here, I think the utilitarians have found much more fertile ground. So there's in the States, you've got this split between the country club Republicans and the free markets, open borders, globalization people, and the working class. And that isn't really being reflected in the British discourse so far. It'll be interesting to see which way reform goes. But I suspect it's already tacking to what the working class want, which is not what the Adam Smith Institute wants particularly. I think it might be a curse of having Mrs. Thatcher being so successful in the 80s. People think you can go back to that. That may be a historical one-off when the state was so expansive. It's only with food and banking at the end of the 70s that you ever encountered the private sector, really. Everything you did was the public sector. So that was it. Thatcher was a historical one-off. I don't think the British conservative or right it doesn't recruit very well, and it doesn't like to think very deeply in the way that sort of MAGA has forced the Americans, the Republicans, to think. Particularly. But remember, the utilitarian, I think one of the most useful things about utilitarian progress studies, whatever you want to call it, because they're cult-ish, I'll choose my words carefully, cults recruit on loyalty and not on talent. And this is why the quality of what you get is so low. And it's actually my starting point for being curious about this was a piece of research which was so shoddy, so shonky, that and was being promoted by a circle of people. I thought, what's going on here? There's a weird sociology. Everyone's like saying this is great. And that was the street votes analysis, which I wrote about at length in The Critic, where they wanted to bulldoze this sleepy close of in East Barnet. Everyone would move out for 2 years, and then you'd have these great 5-story mansion blocks put there, and everyone would be really happy about this. And I just thought, this is so absurd. This idea is not the worst I've heard, but it would have been shot down in the pub if you had a normal kind of interpersonal relationships. There's something weird and culty about this. And that's one of those cases where you sort of pull a thread, and the next thing you know, this carpet warehouse has landed on your head.
But I think to finish the point on, well, what is activism and what isn't, I think quite a lot of this is actually quite performative, and actually what is often much more effective is rather unsung. I mean, so for instance, on the podcast, I have interviewed Rob Bates of the Centre for Migration Control, which is a very small think tank, but which nevertheless has done sterling work getting FOIs about the impact of migration on crime and on the economy in particular, and really delivered story after story for the papers on that and spotlighted this issue. Likewise, there's Open Justice UK. I've had Adam Wren, its director, on the podcast. He's working with Melissa Tor there as well, and they have crowdfunded hundreds of thousands of pounds to obtain grooming gang transcripts of the trials and to carefully redact them with legal experts so that they can be published, then to publish them. And again, that's providing really important information about this terrible issue that we do need to understand more. So, massive props to them. Props to other people just in the online right, as it's called, who are calling attention to all these various issues and reporting on them in ways that you wouldn't really have seen in the mainstream. There's also publications like Pimlico Journal. That's a new one that I think they're doing very good work, and I think we can put the Daily Sceptic in here as well. But this is political activism. This is moving the conversation on, and there's quite a big difference here from the sense that actually you can call yourself an activist and get all these plaudits without actually doing any of the hard work.
Yeah, it's a real pose, isn't it? I mean, hundreds of millions of dollars is literally being showered on people, and they kind of don't know what to do with it. I think that's a great point. what's a good example? There's a lot of coattailing that LFG does, in which something's happened and then they take credit for it. Where in reality they've got ChatGPT to write an infrastructure bill, or there was actually a campaign in two years before Newport and got involved with banning the XL bully, but he took credit for it anyway. He kind of arrived late, took credit, and then, well, there's XL bullies everywhere. How did that go? And I think he did it again with the nuclear bill. He wanted to get his name attached to it. There's a lot of stories behind the nuclear. I've recounted some of them at the Telegraph. There's a lot of VC money has just discovered nuclear energy, and being VCs, they want to remove the safety regulations. So if you talk to really experienced advocates of nuclear energy like Nick Turan and energy bants, they're quite wary of it. I've spoken to a lot of kind of engineers here, and they think they can fend them off, largely because they don't know what they're doing, but also because a lot of this stuff is international, and they don't realise that yet. Technical standards are done by technical people. You can't just waltz in and say, "Hey guys, this is I've got a plan here." The kind of the glibness and coattailing are giveaways that the utilitarians may be onto this or may be involved somewhere. Almost anything with the word progress in it is probably an EA-aligned campaign. Progress Studies, Centre for Progress. I mean, these things pop up everywhere. And they're just very shallow. So, like I said, I think the UK is a laboratory for these experiments. It is a new donor class, and this donor class is very wealthy. I'll give you another example, which is not these groups, but in 2021, the guy Buterin behind the Ethereum coin gave an enormous donation of $600 million to AI safety. And 2 years later, Rishi is having to deny that the world's ending because of AI. Now, there's a connection between suddenly money flooding into a subject which is very esoteric and only kind of almost a hobby for people, and the Rishi hosting a summit which is completely taken over by AI doomers. The key to that story is somebody called Matt Clifford, who becomes the government's go-to AI expert. He runs an EA program called Polaris, and I don't think he's in EA himself. A lot of these people aren't, but he then allows them to dictate the terms of what this debate is about. And so civil servants go into work, and the course material they're seeing is all written by effective altruists. It's all about doomer AI and alignment. The entire debate has been set. All this material has been produced by EA groups. Like I say, the West lobby journalists have no curiosity about this stuff, but it appears in front of people and they go, what the hell is this?
Yes, and another example that we shouldn't forget, actually, is this idea that supposedly with sufficient spreadsheets and PowerPoint presentations and AI graphics, some of these types are going to build a whole new town. Is that going to happen, Andrew?
Well, apparently they've had lots of meetings. Somebody sent me, Joe Reeves gave a progress update, and he said, well, we've had lots of meetings. So I expect to be moving into the Forest City quite soon. I look forward to it. Initially, I guess it will be polycules. Oh, polycules are a huge joke at effective altruism. It's a word that nobody knew until Sam Bankman-Fried was cuffed. His business empire collapsed, and he turned out to be living in this kind of sexless polycule, which is a group of friends who have relationships with each other. So I expect the first inhabitants of the Forest City will be an abundance polycule. Why wouldn't it be?
And then there's this idea of progress studies.
Yeah. So about the end of the 2010s, I think it was quite difficult to push free market liberalism, a world, particularly with Trump having been in for a couple of years. These are really unpopular ideas. Open borders were no longer a popular idea. The idea that the world at peace was all at peace so China could make everything didn't seem so sensible. So I think he had money that money that would have gone to, say, the Cato, started to look for new experiments to try and push supply side ideas out there. So in 2019, Patrick Collinson, who's one of the two Irish brothers who started Stripe, call him a disillusioned effective altruist, teams up with Tyler Cowen at George Mason University, who's a kind of very on the spectrum, very strange guy. He's one of the first bloggers, but this comes over in an Economist profile this year, very kind of odd, lonely guy, starts to disperse funds to effective altruist, utilitarian people. And Tyler has this great phrase for it. I think he's been quite indiscreet this year. Let me dig up this phrase. It would never be such a formal thing or controlled or managed or directed by a small group of people or trademarked. It would be people doing things in a very decentralized way that would reflect a general change of ethos and vibe. So, early recipients are the Mansards and YIMBY and these kind of targeted supply-side interventions.
And sorry, just tell us what the Mansards are.
Well, it was my stupid joke, which I never expected would catch on with anybody, where there was a point a couple of years after the Progress Studies movement is founded, where street votes is getting lots of attention. Unfortunately, not much more practical interventions like, it's not even a very good supply-side intervention. You can reform leasehold, a tremendous thing. 6 million people, including myself, are in a leasehold. Abolish stamp duty or reform stamp duty so you get some liquidity in the market. You're not punishing people for moving up or down. Even the supply-side interventions go, this was ludicrous. Like I said, an idea that would have been shot down in the pub that night. But at the same time, Robert Jenrick had been housing minister and got really pushed back from Tory voters. This is about 2020, 21. And the Tories get very keen on development that doesn't need permission, such as putting a mansard roof on an existing structure.
And what actually is a mansard roof?
A mansard is where you sort of take a roof and put an extra room in the roof, and the mansard is the window. It turns that space into a room, effectively. Georgians did them. You never know what takes off. I've coined many phrases over the years, and many have not taken off. Sadville took off, and the mansard seems to take off, or at least with people in these policy circles. I'm very much an outsider to this, which sort of allows me a bit of freedom. Such is the effect, such is the kind of influence of EA and Progress money, cash. It's so abundant that people are very wary because they might want to be, a recipient someday, which is a very distorting effect on policy. And as we've discussed, particularly on the right.
Okay, well, Andrew Orlowski, thank you very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Thanks for having me, Laurie. Great to be on.
Now, it's been over a year since Kemi Badenoch took over leadership of the Conservative Party. After a rocky start, she has been improving some of her performances in the Commons recently, but have the Tories really learnt their lessons from their 14 torrid years in government? And even if they have, is anyone listening? Well, to find out, I spoke recently to Jack Rankin, the Conservative MP for Windsor, who is among the party's fresh-faced new intake, becoming an MP for the first time during their 2024 general election wipeout. I began by asking him what got him into politics.
Well, effectively, my background, like a lot of members of Parliament. So my parents grew up in urban Greater Manchester, in a kind of Ashton-under-Lyne, which is where Angela Rayner is a member of Parliament. And, they met at school, a comprehensive school, urban Greater Manchester. And they got married and had me not too long after. And my very first memories, when they were in their early 20s, of them going to night school on alternative nights to get the qualifications they needed to set up a small business. That small business is small fry in Windsor terms, small fry in Westminster terms, but it gave me and my brother life opportunities that we could never have dreamed of. And that's small things, a garden, foreign holidays. Where we grew up, that was relatively unusual. And I learned from quite an early age that with hard work and education, you can improve your life. And I didn't grow up in a party political household, although my parents, family was important to us, as was country. So the small C Conservative values. But really in the part of the world where I grew up, the Labour Party was, it wasn't just the massively in control of everything. It was deeply embedded within the psyche of the place, working men's clubs, trade unions. And I really looked at that as like the politics of grievance and dependency, which was designed to keep people like me and my brother down and voting Labour. And when my parents started to get relatively successful, and again, that's a relative phrase. They wouldn't be considered financially successful in my constituency, for example. That instead of being upheld as exactly what you would want working people to do, right, i.e. get skilled, start a small business, employ people, pay taxes. In fact, it was quite sneered at. And by my mid-teens, I was very much a rebel against that kind of that worldview. And I determined that there was a small c with both a small c and a capital C. And I kind of got involved in the party at that age. So there's a kind of blue-collar aspirational conservatism, an aspirational social mobility, ladder of opportunity kind of conservative. But, I didn't do politics at university, and I didn't want to go into politics straight away. I knew it was something I wanted to do in the fullness of time. But I wanted to build a career, get married, make some money. And I'd done lots of that, in fairness. I've got 2 young kids on the housing ladder, married. But I suppose the thing that's maybe accelerated this, I thought I'd be doing this maybe in my 40s. I'm the second youngest Conservative MP. You were good enough to call me fresh-faced. I'm not so sure that is true, but perhaps it is relatively. Is really the state the country's in. And I think the state the country's in, and the West more broadly, is, this country doesn't need a change of government. It kind of needs a change of regime. And I want to be part of a Conservative generation that builds a reformed Conservative Party that can, I don't use these words too lightly, but help save the country.
Well, okay, so a change of regime there, but of course we must talk about the previous regime, must we not? And that, we are off the back of 14 years of Conservative government. So I suppose, what do you see as the key problems that were allowed to fester in that time in government and that have now been bequeathed to us? And where did your predecessors go wrong?
So I think the 14 years thing is slightly unfair, although I do accept that it is totally entrenched in the public's imagination. So we have to deal with it. Because obviously we spent the first 5 years with the Liberal Democrats. We spent 17 to 19 in a minority. We spent 2 or 3 years in the COVID period. So you think about the periods of times when the Conservative Party effectively had an unfettered majority. I think it was a slither of those 14 years in question. I think we should also be clear about some of our successes and the PPS in the education team. And I think what the Conservative Party did for educational outcomes in England was magnificent, and I use that in a strong way. So I think the narrative about 14 years is not quite right, but as I say, it is the public perception. But I think people are write PhDs about where we went wrong, genuinely. You can point to, obviously, the lack of unity and discipline that we lost towards the end. You can talk to the lack of, let's call it, integrity, personal conduct in certain aspects of the way certain people behaved. But I think fundamentally, if you've been in office for a great period of time as a centre-right government, and the state is spending 47% of GDP, right, economically, how would you square that to your core voters? If you've got net migration of 1 million, give or take, in the final year, again, there was reasons for that, or you just think about, frankly, the way public institutions have been captured by aggressive progressive authoritarians. You just look at any government institution, Quango, hospital. The month that those within the private sector call May and July, they just call Pride Month, right? So if you want to talk about economics, you want to talk about migration, if you want to talk about public sector culture, and obviously it's in the private sector too, it's very difficult to make a case that we were running a truly conservative administration. So, that's a big challenge for us, because we have obviously a challenger party on our right now, which poses, I'm not one of these people that thinks reform and just, going to keep climbing, it's going to be easy for them. I think some people on the online right can get that a bit wrong sometimes. But their challenge on our right flank is an existential threat to the Conservative Party. And the problem about trust, so migration, is that it takes years to build it, but you can lose it in a day. So, Kemi and the team are saying all the right things now, I think, on migration, and on economics, and on welfare, and on climate change. But it's going to take years to rebuild trust, but we've got to keep putting one foot in front of the other.
But of course, one of the difficulties is that in that question of rebuilding trust is, of course, the legacy. Now, Kemi Badenoch was herself, of course, a minister in the previous Conservative government. So were many other, so was her potential challengers were generally. But he, of course, notably resigned from the government over immigration, and she didn't do that. And in some ways, there's a lot of concern there'll be a continuity there. There's inability to distinguish what she's doing now from that mindset. What do you make of her leadership?
So I don't think that's fair at all. So you're right, that's the perception that we've got to challenge. Mm-hmm. But, as you say, Robert resigned over migration on a point of principle. And Kemi was pretty famous for being one of the secretaries of state that in the right round process, which is where when a government department wants to do something, it has to write to all the other departments effectively and get ministerial sign-off for what they want to do, because obviously this collective responsibility exists. Kemi was famous for being one of the blockers of all these, right? So if you'd have said to any of us on the right, which I think, might include ourselves, before the leadership contest, you're going to have a runoff between Kemi Badenoch and Robert Jenrick, would have snatched your hand off, right? And there's not really a piece of paper. There's obviously a piece of paper between them in approach, but there's not a piece of paper between them in terms of policy. And that is robust, authentic conservatism I would quite happily defend to anybody on the right. I mean, just think about what our policies have been, right? So on migration, we've said that it's now Conservative Party policy to leave the European Court of Human Rights, Convention of Human Rights. Now, I think that's the right thing. It's not a silver bullet. I don't think it's one thing that we need to really deeply think through. But if you just said 2 years ago, 3 years ago, whatever period you want to change, that the Conservative Party, that would be their policy. And not only would it be it's their policy, but not a single MP would rebel against it. And not a single MP would turn up on Newsnight to talk about it and denounce their party leader. So I think the party has genuinely internalised some of its failings in office and has come out the blocks, having learned those lessons. The Climate Change Act, for God's sake, which was passed by a Conservative government, we said we repeal it. And again, has any of our members, MPs, said that's a bad thing or gone on Newsnight to denounce it? No. And on both of them,
there has been some resistance to that. So.
Not of our MPs, from the old, from past colleagues, there has. So, particularly around the May administration, but they're not in the House of Commons anymore. And I think there's a wider point there, if I may, Laurie, and I think this is something that the right really needs to understand. What is the most egregious thing about the human rights architecture and the Climate Change Act? What do they have in common? Well, they seek to turn political decisions, which have been historic in the British constitutional, political decisions made in the division lobbies of the House of Commons, made in general elections, into legalistic value decisions that we're then asking lawyers to determine. Because whatever you and I think about what climate policy should be made in the House of Commons over there, and it should be made by me in division lobbies of the House of Commons and at general elections. Same thing with our immigration policies or our criminal justice policies. It shouldn't be in the hands of a legalistic construct, which is a Blairite constitutional construct. And if any centre-right government of the future is to be successful, of whatever flavour, we really need to rip out that legislation so that we're empowered in the House of Commons once again.
Okay, let's talk about probably the worst single part of the Tory legacy, which is, of course, the Boris wave. Now, well, to start with, I mean, how catastrophic was that? I had David Frost come on here now, Lord Frost now, head of the IEA, coming on talking about how there's a total catastrophic failure. Yeah. I wonder if you agree with that. Why did things go so wrong there, and how do you recover trust on that?
Yeah, so I would agree. I would agree with you that the worst aspects and the biggest failure that we've got to overcome in terms of public policy, but also public perception, is what you term the Boris wave. And I think it is, some people don't like that phrase, but I think it's difficult to argue that it's a fair phrase to use. I mean, I think there's two separate issues here, if I may give you a longer-winded answer. You've got the way the British state, the Treasury particularly, think about the economics of migration and the short-termist way that our public policy is ran. So what happens, for example, is, adult social care, right? It's incredibly important to the country. If you go to any council in the country, which is almost everyone is functionally bust or near to being bust, 70% of their spend is adult social care, and most of that 70% is minimum wage employment costs, right? So the care homes say, right, we need more people to work in care homes, else there's going to be, the costs are going to go up. And so the Treasury model says, well, we need people to come and do these jobs, right? And there's something on the face of it which makes sense to that as an argument, okay? But the reality is that they don't look at this in lifetime costs. So, for example, say the average person in this country who were minimum wage their entire adult life. So they did everything, obeyed by the law, just the average person on minimum wage. Their net cost to the taxpayer over their lifetime is about £400,000. Okay. So if you bring somebody in to do a minimum wage job and they abide by the law, you still got to pay the pension. There's probably significant subsidy of their housing costs, right? Just by the nature of forget that they're a foreigner, the nature of their demographic profile. So when the Treasury says, oh, well, we're going to save money on, next year on this adult social care bill, it doesn't look at the lifetime costs of these individuals. And the other thing about the Boris wave of migration, less than 50% of them were work visas. Right, 15% of them were health and social care visas. There's a huge number of dependents that have moved across. So not only are you bringing someone over who's net fiscally negative, you're bringing then dependents over whose fiscal contribution is overwhelmingly likely, I would suggest, you're going to be negative. So you've got a short-termist Treasury decision, actually, which is a financial catastrophe, and there is a financial ticking time bomb to the Boris wave, and that's why I think we should seek to amend ILR rules. But obviously, there's a cultural problem, right? 1 million people a year, right? That's a city the size of Southampton, right? A year. In 3 years, that's a city the size, I think I'm right to say, of Birmingham. Whether you are a Liberal, Conservative, Labour, whatever axis you want to choose, that is deeply unsustainable. So I think we really need to change the financial way we think about these things. And we also need to think about a rate of change of migration which can be reasonably integrated into a wider British society. And I don't think either of those is true on the Boris wave. But why was there a particular failure in those years?
Well, we can go into that in a second, but before we do, I mean, you agree it's a mistake. You agree that ILR should be reformed. Yeah. So it should be reformed to be retrospective to increase the level from 5 years to 10 years, as is currently your policy. Yeah. And that will therefore apply to the Boris wave. That's what you're saying.
Right. So we don't want to remove anybody who has got, who's here legally in the first place and has got this ILR to remove, unless there's in significant instances, right? So we've made clear two things. We've made clear that anybody who commits a crime, who has got indefinite leave to remain, should that have removed. And we've also said there should be an economic test. Now, I think Kemi's going to do a reset over the next couple of weeks to make it clear what our policy is, but there is going to be an economic test to this, okay? So there'll be people who've come here legally to do jobs, but will not be allowed to, in my understanding, to be granted British citizenship and stay indefinitely, is my understanding.
It's certainly not clear at the moment, though, because, of course, Katie Lamb, your colleague, recently talked about making people have to go home, and she was publicly slapped down by Kemi Badenoch, who said, quote, "We don't believe in making things retrospective." So that suggests that she's not so serious about taking on the...
Well, I think there's a little bit of talking at cross purposes here, but I think Kemi is going to come out in the next couple of weeks and make it clear exactly what our policy is. But Katie was only describing what was in our amendments to the deportation bill, which was signed by, obviously, Chris Philp some months ago. So as far as I understand it, I think Katie got some of her language wrong. I think she's recognised that. But I think she was just outlining what party policy was. And as I say, Kemi's going to say something in the next few weeks. But let's be clear, British citizenship cannot be removed unless in the most extreme examples. And we saw that with Shamima Begum, for example. But people who are not British citizens who commit egregious crimes, I'm not talking about speeding fines here, but, violent crimes, of course they should have their indefinite leave to remain to be removed and be sent back to their country of origin. I would say that was a basic principle that would be very difficult for anyone to disagree with.
Well, quite. But the slightly more politically difficult principle, the one that, as you very much point to there, is going to be very economically damaging, is what about someone who's come over as a dependent, maybe in 2021, they're currently expected to get ILR next year or perhaps the year after that, depending.
Yeah, well, I would change the rules.
You would, but that would, I mean, presumably that would essentially be retrospective.
Well, it wouldn't be retrospective for somebody who's got ILR, would it? It would be saying these are changing the rules to the Labour government did it when it was in office. Charles Clarke did that when he was the Home Secretary. He extended the amount of years. So I don't think that's a Rubicon we should be too sensitive about. Obviously, we should be sensible about it and moderate and disciplined. But ultimately, our immigration policies, and the whole point of our immigration policies, should be it serves the British national interest. And if we don't think that the current immigration policies serve the British national interest, we should change them, right? And that's what we're here for.
Well, quite. But I mean, it's not me being sensitive about it.
Yeah,
it's your leader, it seems to be. But okay, let's move on then. The British state.
Yeah.
I mean, you've mentioned how it's sclerotic. It's not working as it should do. Why do we need a Great Repeal Act?
Well, look, the greatest question in politics across millennia is the size of the state, right? It's do you have a smaller state, let's say in the modern world, the American model, lower taxes, weaker public services, or do you have a Scandinavian type state where you have higher taxes, higher state, more wraparound kind of welfare system? And that's the oldest political question in the book. And I'm on the centre right, and I generally think that it should be smaller and that individuals should be in question. But what we seem to have managed to construct in the United Kingdom is we seem to have Scandinavian taxes and American public services. Right? Just think about that. That's totally ridiculous. It's very difficult to argue with that. The British public feel taxed up to their Revy Hill. But if your nana falls over in the middle of the night and breaks her hip, she'd be sat in her own for hours under blankets waiting for an ambulance. So I think anyone who suggests the system is working or there should be managerial changes or tweaks to the current kind of British state, I think is talking total nonsense. You talk about the Great Repeal Act, right? I mean, define that. So I think part of this is the way the British Constitution is off track to how it's historically been, right? The Parliament should be sovereign. We should have some kind of sense of popular sovereignty, which we determine who our governments are and our policies at general election. And we heard Starmer. I've just come over the bridge from PMQs, and he talked about they have to change the Northern Irish legislation because it's illegal. And it's like the British Prime Minister should never say that. The whole reason to have a majority in the House of Commons is to set the law. You know, Parliament judges cannot tell Parliament the law is not legal. If it's not, we should change it, right? And that there's something here about mindset, right? And it's about what is the historical British constitutional law. And that is we have a political constitutionalism in this country, which is different to many on the continent, which have a legal constitutionalism. They can have their constitutions however they like. But since the late 90s, we have warped our constitution to create legislation that operates like constitutional legislation and removes political decisions from the House of Commons, which is where they should sit. And that has meant when we have elected politicians or changed laws, we've not actually changed the way the state has operated. So I'll use climate change as an example. I believe that we should be exploring gas and oil in the North Sea. I think that's in the British national interest. Okay, you could disagree with that. I'm sure you don't disagree with that, but you can, right? We should determine that in the House of Commons. At the moment, today, it would be illegal for Ed Miliband to effectively grant an oil licence in the North Sea, because what would happen is that decision would get JR'd and there's some kind of appeal, and the judges would say, well, that's inconsistent with your obligations under the Climate Change Act, because the Climate Change Commission, which is a quango created by the Climate Change Act, says to hit the net zero target by X, you can't do Y.
So the amendment, net zero by 2050 target was brought in under
disgracefully. And because what that does is it means that the House of Commons is not in charge of energy policy. And that's what the Equalities Act does, and that's what the Human Rights Act does. So what a Great Repeal Act should achieve, in my worldview, is it should re-empower the House of Commons and ministers responsible to the House of Commons to make decisions in the British national interest and responsive to British public concern. And that is where our political decisions should be made. I think we also need to, on a similar theme, significantly reduce the scope of and the number of significantly quangos for exactly the same reason, really. We need to be empowering the House of Commons to make its decisions. And you say, so why is that important? And why is it important? Because if the country needs the radical change that I think you and I think it needs, and we change the composition of the House of Commons. But all that legislation stays in place and all those quangles stay in place. The British state will continue to do exactly what it's continued to do for the last couple of decades. And one of the pinpoints of why we didn't do so well as I think we should have done in office was because I think in many respects we were in office, not in power, because we sat in that constitutional construct, added to it in some various degrees. And if we're to have not just change of government, but change of regime, and that's the kind of language I would use, then we're going to have to massively disempower the administrative state in favour of a popular sovereignty in the House of Commons.
And what was it about that time in government? I know you weren't in it yourself. You weren't in the party, you weren't an MP at that point, rather. But why was it that so many of these constitutional weeds that had grown up, the Equality Act you mentioned, the Climate Change Act 2008, but those other ones were actually brought in under a Conservative government? Why were these not pulled up? So
I don't think this is a recent failure of the past. I think what Conservative Party has done over the last 100 years is the left has come in and have took the country this way, and we've criticised them in the process, and then we've put a brake on it, and then it's been a stop, and then we've gone back. We've never put the clock back 5 seconds. There is an instinct among small C Conservative people, generally speaking, and I don't think this is true today because I think the scale of failure is so very obvious to so many people. But I think there's been a scale of, things fundamentally work, right? So what we should do here is bring a managerial sense to this, better administration. Let's make it a bit leaner. Let's try to reform it. There's been a kind of a small C Conservative reluctance to kind of, create revolution, if you know what I mean, and I think that is more often than not the right instinct for people on the centre right. But I think it's a bit like, I don't see the Great Repeal Act in a kind of revolutionary way. I see it in a restoration way, just like Brexit was. I didn't see that as a revolutionary act. I saw that as the restoration of a millennium years of normal constitutional function, and I see the same thing as the Great Repeal Act. But I think one of the things you've seen on people on the right is a split between, things are fundamentally working. Maybe we should work to make public services more efficient. Maybe we should try to get more growth in the system and then release the tax burden. I think there is now a broader sense on the right that the British state doesn't act in the British public's interest and the British national interest. So it deserves some more, call it revolution, I call it, as I say, restorational piece of radical work. Because I think we've been naive about how some of these institutions have been captured by some of our ideological opponents. I think there's a degree of naivety there. There's been a degree of naivety in the past. And I think there's an instinct of small C Conservative people, generally speaking, not to rock the boat too much. But I think given the scale of challenges, the weight of opinion on that has shifted somewhat. And I think you've seen that, for example, with migration. Yeah, I've used the ECHR example already, but if you'd have said, 2 years, 3 years ago, that had been our party policy, people would have laughed at you, okay? But why? Well, people have seen it every single week, a failure in the courts where the ECHR is being applied in a way that was never, ever, ever meant by its founders, and it's morphed out of control. So, people just looking at the empirical evidence in front of them and thinking this needs much more radical change than has been true in the past.
But of course, as you laid out there, in many ways, the past 200 years, the Conservative Party has been conserving the gains of the left. They have this Burkean conservative streak where they don't want to do a revolution. They don't want to be too radical. That's not really their instinctual way of doing things. But of course, the public, Reform are polling at almost twice. Your poll figures at the moment are really in no mood for incremental change and a sort of few tweaks to the system. Yeah. They want something rather radical. How can you convince people that the Conservatives are the party to actually have that radicalism?
Okay, yeah. So there's a few things there. So I use the business analogy here. Okay, so for a political party, its share price is its polling number, right? And our polling number has decreased significantly in the medium term, but also, frankly, since the last general election. We're now polling in the high teens. Okay, so there's this instinct for people to panic somewhat, and I can understand that instinct to some degree, right? Our share price to continue this analogy. You look at Reform share price, you think, well, there you go, there's your answer. That's the future, right? That's where I should buy my shares. But I would the greatest investor of the 20th century is Warren Buffett, right? And he kind of says, well, look, shares go up because people buy shares. Of course they do, but you should buy companies for their fundamentals, right? And I would point to the fundamentals of the Conservative Party versus Reform. Look, I have a lot of respect for Nigel Farage. This country, in my view, would never have left the European Union if it wasn't for his one-man insurgency campaign that he has waged for decades and put pressure from the right for the Conservative Party and made it act. He deserves this country's thanks and praise for that, in my opinion, and we shouldn't underestimate that. But there's a total difference between running a kind of guerrilla campaign like that and then radically transforming the British state, for a start. Okay, so if you largely agree with the what I've described, the change that the British state needs, right, that is going to be immensely difficult, right? You're going to need 350, 400 disciplined members of parliament. You're going to need 100 people to be ministers. I'm not saying that we wouldn't find this difficult either, but they've lost 40% of their members of parliament in a year. Right? So imagine if the British population did elect a reform government, what's to say they're not going to lose 40% of their members of parliament within a year, right? Why is that the case? And then they kick people like Rupert Lowe out and then welcome in, Andrew Jenkin and Jake Berry and Nadine Dorries. And I'm thinking, oh, well, if you're going to be like this seriously disciplined and radical, right-wing force, are you going to do that with Andrew Jenkin and Dean Dorries and Jay Berry? Is that what that tells me? That's not what I hear, at least. Danny Kruger is a different example. I have a lot of time for Danny, How
upset were you by his departure?
Yeah, well, it was different to those other names I mentioned because he is a good man, he is a wise man, he is a smart man, and he is he's not a careerist, right? He's moved there because, I disagree with him profoundly, but he's not a self-interested, kind of chap, right? He's done that because he thinks that's the best. So I disagree with him, but, I wish him all the best. And I would make a very difference between that. And politics, like anything, is a personal business, right? And I consider Danny a friend, and he's still a friend, that's not changed. But that is personally difficult. But I just don't think that, and you look at Nigel over the years, about how any poppy has come anywhere close to him, he's just chopped the heads off, right? You can't do that in a parliamentary democracy. Maybe you can do it in a presidential system. But Starmer's got a majority of 170, and it's not even clear to me that he's going to last the year. So imagine a Farage type figure, even if he gets a massive majority, he's losing 40% of his MPs a year, and he cuts down any poppy that comes close to him in size. It's not clear to me that Reform would be able to deliver any of the change that we need. Whereas I see a Conservative Party which is getting serious on migration, it's getting serious on the Equalities Act, it's getting serious on climate change. Whatever you think of our history, if you watch Kemi's speech on the Wednesday, that was a proper statement of authentically conservative values, which I think gathered some sense, obviously it's early days, of the scale the country needs. And there's a serious team behind her in almost every regard. And we are getting our act. I appreciate it's not coming through to the public yet, and it's not, because we've not got this right to hear. But if you look at our organisation in the chamber, we've won the last 4 or 5 PMQs. CCHQ seems to be getting its operation going. I see a real sense that a reformed Conservative Party, early days, could be starting to exist to do this radical change. I do not see that, I'm afraid, with Reform. I think when you look at its polling numbers, really, as opposed to a groundswell of support for them, I see them as like a lightning rod for dissatisfaction. And I also see a lack of intellectual coherence. I don't see this kind of disciplined group of people that have got an embedded block of support that can make this change. I just don't see it, I'm afraid, Laurie.
Let's move on. Hope Not Hate.
Yes.
Activist charity run by Nick Lowles, sort of famous left-wing, activist of various kinds. In September, you referred them to the Charity Commission.
Yes.
Why was that?
Well, I think a lot of these so-called anti-fascist charities are nothing of the sort. I think they're simply, aggressive, progressive authoritarians who believe incredibly strongly in their moral righteousness, that almost anybody else can be dismissed out of hand as some kind of radical and extremist. And I think particularly, I think Hope Not Hate have this kind of, they have that moral certainty, which I think is both wrong, and I think they're wrong in some of the people that they target. But what's particularly pernicious of it is how they go about it. Right? They're not having political arguments with people. They're trying to dox people, get people to lose their jobs. I was gobsmacked by the amount of people who reached out to my office when we wrote this letter, who had the most horrendous things happen to them in their lives and in their careers because of effectively, political doxing exercise, which is, underhand and aggressive in my opinion. But particularly, that's a point of disagreement that I've outlined there why I wouldn't support them, not why I'd reported them. Why I reported them is that they effectively use their, in my opinion, and what my letter says is that they are advancing a hyper-political agenda using charitable means, which is not, in my understanding of the regulations, the way that these things should happen. So if they're doing some of these things as a limited company or as private individuals, I would disagree with the means, but it wouldn't be a matter for the Charity Commission. But I think this is a Charity Commission issue because I think they're breaching the concepts of the charitable boundaries. I also think, some of the things that came back to me in some of those responses and what were described, and obviously I can't vouch for the veracity of all these statements, but some of the behaviour that was described to me would certainly sound to me to be alleged criminal behaviour. But I think that's the kind of thing that organisations like that are considered by the administrative state, the permanent state that exists, to be kind of somehow good, right? And it wouldn't surprise me at all if many of our police forces actually, had continued dialogue with Hope Not Hate in combating whatever it is they think they're combating.
Well, that is a key question.
Yeah.
And so you say that these kind of hyper-political activities shouldn't be allowed by the Charity Commission.
Yeah.
In fact, in 2006, it was the Blair government which widened the definition of charitable purposes to include things like advancing human rights, advancing diversity and equality.
And all those things, are hyper-political.
What one has to note is that, certainly the Conservative government did not repeal that. And indeed, it as part of the big society program under David Cameron, the idea was actually, we've been talking about sovereignty a lot here, parliamentary sovereignty. The idea, let me just read a quote to you actually, but it was, part of their compact with civil society in 2010 was about, quote, transferring power away from central government to local communities. And by that, they essentially mean activist civil society organisations, of which Hope Not Hate is one. I mean, so do you think that the Conservative government has allowed that charity state, that blob, to fester?
So I suspect we have, in terms of, again, I suspect that change was probably didn't attract much attention at the time, and I don't remember it. But I'm assuming this is the kind of thing that's fundamentally rewired the way these things work, like many of what Blair did, right? So I think we've been naive about how the subtle changes of legislation at the top. So, I couldn't, I'm not on top of that area of legislation enough, but it seems to me that that's absolutely something we should be looking at. In terms of the big society agenda, and this is where I think we have to be, just take a step back again. I think there's probably something we were also naive about in office was public appointments, right? So effectively, allowed the same kind of reheated Blairites kind of just enter all these kind of, the boards of all these things that help these things to operate.
Would you reform the Judicial Appointments Commission?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And the bishops, all that, everything, all that needs to change. And Robert Jenrick, in his speech to conference, outlined the way that we should re-empower the Lord Chancellor. And again, that's Blairite constitutional construct, right? So what do we do is, you literally hear people in House of Commons talking about the separation of powers, and you're like, you've been watching too much West Wing. What are you talking about? Right? That's not the way the British state has ever functioned. In fact, we have a system which actively fuses them, right? The King in Parliament is sovereign, right? So the reason we had the judges in the House of Lords is historic, but it's also, we want the judges to be interpreting Parliament's laws fundamentally, and having them there gives them that, very much that, our building shape ourselves, as Churchill said. Putting them there is important. Making them a Supreme Court and making them think that they have this they're the referee, which is not what appeal judges in the British constitutional section should be doing. Same thing's true of the Lord Chancellor, right? The Lord Chancellor should be the head of the judiciary. And it's not inappropriate for a cabinet minister to be head of the judiciary because sovereignty comes from the public. Obviously, they should be of operational dependence. But absolutely, if we think judges are misapplying the law, then they should be removed. And we should appoint them with some democratic oversight. And the left, if they heard me say that, would think what I've just described is some outrageous usurpation of power. But that's just moving the British Constitution back to, I think it's 2005. It was Jack Straw when he was Secretary of State for Justice, which changed the Lord Chancellor from sitting on the wolf's side, created the Supreme Court and created this. And so, judges, but the bishops, right? If you want to know why the Church of England is totally off-piste to the overwhelming majority of the small c conservative majority in England, and the Church of England pews are full of those people, it's because, you've created a quango that appoints these people, so they appoint the same people as they appoint to every bloody quango and public appointment. So they just look like NGO chief executives. They don't look like people who are planting churches and speaking the gospel of Christ, I'm afraid. And we see that right across the thing. So I think there's a degree in activity. In terms of the big society, I'm not sure I recognise everything you say there. There's loads of civic society in my constituency that I'm very proud of. And I would describe most of those organisations as small c conservative, service-driven people who, want to tidy up the flower beds, right? It's probably a small number of charities that run off with this stuff. But just like with the BBC this week, if you really want to defend civic society when there's egregious breaches of the principles, then you should actually be a stern challenger of it, because that actually defends the institutions behind them.
Okay, well, we're coming up on time here. Let's just go through some quick fire questions. It's been over a year of Kemi Badenoch as leader, so letters can go into the 1922 committee now, calling for a leadership election. How many do you think have gone in?
None.
You think? You're sure?
Well, look, I don't know. They obviously, no one knows. But the reality is that we have got to learn our lessons of chopping and changing our leader at every single opportunity. We looked fundamentally unserious for doing so. And let's not pretend she hasn't had a total hospital pass in taking on this job. And I think she has... Mrs. Badenoch has been good enough to admit that perhaps there was things out the blocks that she could have been quicker on. But if you look at that conference speech and look at the way the team is coming together at the minute and the wins that we're chalking on the board, I think people will be mad to think we should change our leader at the moment.
Does Robert Jenrick want to be leader?
I kind of find these questions a bit kind of like gotcha. I know you don't mean it that way. I mean, there's probably a part of every single member of the House of Commons that wants to be the Prime Minister, right? So it's kind of, I find it, a difficult questions to answer, because I'm sure he probably does. That is very different to saying that we should be making any kind of changes whatsoever. I mean, I've just come straight across the bridge from PMQs, and Kemi handed the Prime Minister, it on a lap, and she has done the last 4 or 5 times. The policy direction of the party and the unity of our parliamentary party is I'm actually really quite proud of it. And none of us want to do anything silly, Laurie.
Well, let's come on to a more substantive gotcha question. So, demographics.
Yeah,
we've spoken about the Boris wave as a fiscal problem, a problem of democratic consent, but there is the problem of the future demographics of the country, what it's going to look like. At the present projections put the point at which Britain will become minority white at 2063, and earlier for England. How much of a concern is that for you?
Well, it depends what you mean. So I have no track with, kind of ethno-nationalism, right? The concept of being British by its very nature is a national definition. What I do have a concern about is our naive multiculturalism, right? So if people choose to come to this country and fully integrate into this country, and their grandfathers came from a different continent to my grandfathers, I'm intensely relaxed. What I am not relaxed at all about is the pace of immigration that has meant 2 things. One, the pace has meant that we have not had the time to integrate people. If you bring in 1 million people a year, then they are not going to have time or the pace to integrate into a majority British culture, which I think is an absolute must in terms of our obligations. So I'm concerned about the pace of the change, as it were, because I don't believe that it's going to be in the pace of change that we've seen and which you describe being projected out, one in which, our common nationhood and that sense of self should be preserved. But I'm not bothered about the proportion of where people's, as I say, great grandfathers come from. And the second thing I think that's linked to that is about how naive we've been over the past decades about multiculturalism. So if people come to this country, they should be in the national interest to come. So they should be here legally, and I think we should insist that they are obviously fiscally contributing in the overwhelming majority of instances. So that should be a basic filter applied. But we should also not be shy about saying that if you want to, this is not true of workers who come and working for 5 years in the city or comes as a student. But if you want to settle here and become a British citizen, then there should be an expectation that people integrate into the majority culture.
And
I don't think we haven't seen that. So the pace of migration and the way we've been naive about integration in the decades is why people get concerned about that. I think if the pace was such that people were integrated and there was a kind of a forceful integration process, I don't mean by force, but using the levers of the state, to be assertive about this. Now, I don't think we'd have a problem in these instances, but I'm really not bothered about where people's grandparents come from, Laurie.
But, so we've seen, for instance, last week, the Birmingham having to ban Maccabi Tel Aviv fans from central Birmingham. It was essentially, Jews were not allowed to go into Birmingham because of the demographics of that part of the city. It's 71% Muslims in Aston Park. And you had, of course, those sectarian Muslim MPs who are leading that.
Yeah.
This is obviously not integrated.
Yeah, that's a massive failure of integration, yeah.
But, do you not accept that this is partly just the weight of numbers here? If you have somewhere that's like that, there's no amount of integration strategies that is going to be able to create a normal society.
Okay, so we should be very clear about what happened with Maccabi Tel Aviv and Aston Villa, because there's lots of people with counterfactuals. Effectively, we couldn't invite Israeli fans to England's second city, because of a significant population of people who are anti-Semitic, right? And that is overwhelmingly the people that you described. We have an unintegrated, significant minority in Birmingham, and we need to have serious questions in the country about that, right? We're going to need serious policy interventions, right? So, for example, I think we need to crack down on chain migration, for example. I think we need to crack down on things like what happened with the Batley school teacher, okay? So we can't cede ground effectively, because the way we've policed things in the kind of British context has been to try to diffuse tensions, right? And that might make sense in a homogeneous society, but it doesn't when you've got values which are inconsistent with the values that we must insist our visitors and then people who settle here abide by. In fairness to the government, they were very robust on this. They condemned obviously the Westminster's police decision. It was a shame that the Maccabi Tel Aviv group said they weren't going to come in any instance, even if the police gathered. This is a massive problem. There's going to have to be massive policy interventions. But to come back to your initial questions, the problem isn't where people's grandfathers came from. It's because there's not been integration of this, minority but not minority in that group. We have to do things like, for example, not allocate council housing. I think Denmark do something like this in areas where more than 35% of people are from the same ethnic background, right? Which effectively says, no, you cannot have your areas where, your ghettos, right, where you have a parallel society. We should be very robust on that. But you're right that the numbers we've had make that impossible. We should reduce numbers of migration incredibly, if not go to net emigration over the next decade or so. Obviously, that'll come from different avenues, but I think that's the place we need to go to. And then we do need an aggressive integration strategy. But a success would be the grandchildren of you've described being integrated into majority British success in 50, 60 years. Not trying to create an ethnic, white nationalist British state. I have no trouble with that idea whatsoever.
Okay, and so finally then, I know you're a bit of a history buff. Let's talk about someone.
Am I?
I've heard.
Okay, right, yeah.
Or at least there's historical figures. You're interested in one of them,
Yeah.
Alfred the Great.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Who was, in his own way, was able to integrate a diverse society.
Well, okay, yeah, you could use that analogy, yeah.
Namely Christianity.
Yeah.
Well, why do you think he's a significant figure, and why do we need to know more about him?
Well, I think one of the things that we struggle with in our education, and it comes down to integration as well, is this country has the proudest national story, I would argue, of any nation on earth. We have inculcated, the Christian values, and then come up with the common law and constitutional government and parliamentary democracy, and exported these the world over. And that is a unique and organic millennia of story, which created the British Empire and the wonderful nations that spun out of that, and the United States, and then obviously defeating of fascists and communists, and effectively Western values are things that were created on these islands. I'm very proud in my constituency. That's where the Runnymede where the Magna Carta was sealed. It wasn't signed, it was sealed. And the American Bar Institute are the people who've erected the memorial there, right? Our constitutional heritage belongs not just to us, and we should be very proud of it, but to the world. I think King Alfred is one of those figures who's forgotten, because often when we teach history, what do we teach? We teach the Normans, we teach the Tudors, we teach the Nazis, right? We've lost this. I think we should be teaching people more narrative history so they can understand quite that contribution to the world, and understand, why we have these norms and values, which, if we're going to integrate significant people, we have to evangelize around. And King Alfred was obviously the guy who, it was his grandson Athelstan that was probably the first king of England, but he was in many ways the founder of the English nation. The stories about Alfred, the Danes effectively overran the country, right? And it felt that England was probably going to be snubbed out, but he hid in the marshes and defeated the great heathen army in 878. I think I might be right in saying, to effectively, to save England's existence, and obviously his children, Edward and Ethelred, and then his grandson Athelstan went to secure that legacy. So we should be very proud of our nation's history, England's nation's history, Britain's national history, and its contribution to the world. And that would really help us if we were more vocal about that history and that contribution, and we're less British about it, if I might say so. We might have a better chance of saving this country, and also integrating some of the people you describe.
Jack Rankin, thank you very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Cheers, Laurie. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Now, while the left loves to complain about billionaires, the real rent seekers in today's economy are the Green Blob. And to discuss that today, I'm very pleased to be joined by Ben Pile, who is a journalist and Daily Sceptic regular. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you, Laurie. Good to be back.
Yes, very, very good to have you here. So, Ben, as we've said there's all this complaints about capitalism and so on, and how corrupt it is from the left, typically in our political discourse. But, the real crony capitalists are those people in the Green Blob, those people owning the wind turbine firms and others like it, who could really well be described as crony capitalists.
Yeah, or perhaps even worse, rent seekers. This week we learned that the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero's National Energy Systems Operator, which is the body that's sort of set up to manage the UK's electricity supply, which was bought from the National Grid by the government a year or so ago, has streamlined the queues that there are for building such things as wind farms and solar farms and battery banks and so on and so forth. And they, amid much fanfare, they're claiming that this is going to unlock, which is their favourite word, which should set our spidey senses tingling, £40 billion per year.
That's the end of the free part of the podcast. If you'd like to listen to the bonus interview, you'll need to become a regular donor to the Daily Sceptic. For as little as £5 a month, not only will you be able to watch or listen to the whole podcast, You'll also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion forum on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest content on the Daily Sceptic with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. Once you've become a donor, log in to the Daily Sceptic using the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Remember, you can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate.